This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 836 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's sleeper show was better than the one before that, so that's good. On the bad end of things, I was wrong about Taylor Heineke and Will Levis as streamers. Josh Reynolds had another bad day. Nick Westbrook-Akine wasn't a very good deep sleeper, and pretty much all of the tight end picks were bad. Not everything was butterflies and rainbows last week. That's what's going to happen with a sleeper show like this. With that being said, I was really pleased with the Rico Dowdle pick. Josh Dobbs was awesome. Devin Singletary finally came through for me. Jaden Reed scored over 19 PPR points. Noah Brown was great. And even Quentin Johnson scored. So there were the every week misses in there, but there were also some really good hits. I'll take it. Let's keep things moving into week 11. Now, as usual, let's kick things off with a bunch of players you might be able to start who are rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, and we'll begin with Jordan Love. Love gets the Chargers this week, and as I noted on the 50 transactions episode, the Chargers are the best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Quarterbacks against LA have scored 4.4 more points per game than their season-long averages. Love has surprisingly provided an okay enough floor this season in fantasy, despite his struggles. There's more potential for a ceiling game this week against LA. Russell Wilson at the time of this recording is also rostered in fewer than 50% of Yahoo leagues. The Broncos are still massive regression candidates when it comes to how they're scoring their touchdowns, because on the season, they scored 19 offensive touchdowns, and just one of those touchdowns have come on the ground. With that being said, Russell Wilson himself has not been bad this year in fantasy, all things considered. When you adjust his performance for strength of opponent, he's around the QB 11 in points per game. Denver's had one of the toughest schedules to start the year. Now, Minnesota's not the easiest matchup in the world, but there aren't many options at quarterback this week, so I do think that Russ is fine. Now, moving on to running back, I'm going to start with Ty Chandler. He's likely going to see most of the backfield work from Minnesota this week, as long as Alexander Madison's out. Denver's the best opponent by adjusted fantasy points allowed this season to running backs. And while a lot of that has to do with how they performed against Miami earlier this year, they're second to last in success rate allowed on the ground. That's more of a binary way of looking at how well they've stopped the run. They have not been good against the run. I'll have more on this backfield a little bit later, but Chandler makes for a potential RB2 play this week. Tajay Spears is still rostered in just 39% of leagues. I know his standalone value isn't amazing, but he's usable at times, and he has upside if Derrick Henry gets hurt. So you should roster him if he's on your waiver wire. But yeah, this is a sleeper show. This isn't a 15 transaction show. I do think that there's some usability this week, though. Jacksonville, their opponent, ranks second in adjusted target share allowed to running backs, meaning teams are targeting their running backs at a higher rate than normal when they face the Jags. Over Tajay Spears' last 3 games, all 3 with Will Levis, he's seen target shares of 14.8%, 16.7%, and 13.2%. Those are all really good marks. So I think that Spears makes a lot of sense for people who are struggling at running back this week. There's also Darrell Henderson. Kyron Williams is not back yet. We get another week of Darrell Henderson as sort of the 1A in this Rams backfield. Henderson's been averaging a running back rush share per game of 54% and a target share per game of 8.1% over his 3 games with LA. The Rams get the Seahawks this week. That's a team that's given up the 3rd most adjusted fantasy points to running backs this year. It's hard to be totally in love with a play like this, but Henderson's fine. And then lastly, a running back in this tier is Rico Dowdle. This could be yet another game for Dallas where they have a weird game script. They're 10.5 point favorites against the Panthers this weekend, according to FanDuel Sportsbook. Carolina is the second best matchup for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. And as we saw last week, Dowdle not only looks pretty good, but he saw a season-high 43% running back rush share. You're really crossing your fingers for a touchdown with Rico Dowdle. Let's just be honest here, because he's not heavily involved as a receiver. But the matchup, the game situation, it's there for him this week. At wide receiver, I'm looking at both Arizona Cardinals wideouts in this range. Not Marquise Brown, he's rostered in way more than 50% of leagues, but Rondale Moore and Michael Wilson. Moore seems like the safer bet given his 25.8% target share last week. And as I mentioned on yesterday's 10 Trends episode, according to FantasyLife.com, Moore's average at the target last week was 8.1. He had a 23% air yard share. That was by far his highest mark of the season. and it was the first game with Kyler Murray. To me, that's noteworthy. Now, long term, I think Michael Wilson has more upside. He has more intrigue. And you can even look at him this week. Wilson saw more down the field targets than Moore last week, and he was really close to finding the end zone. In a matchup against the Texans and what could be a relatively high scoring game, I think both of these wide receivers make sense as sleepers. The Buffalo Bills get the Jets this week. New York has been by far the best team against wide receivers and adjusted points allowed. It's a tough matchup. But Khalil Shakir is a little bit interesting because the Jets allow the fourth highest target share to the slot across the entire league. Shakir has run 76% of his routes from that area of the field. Now, he only hit an 8% target share last week, but I'd expect that 8% to rise to 12 to 15% this week. And if that happens, he has a chance to be flex-worthy. Now, it sounds like Justin Fields is going to be back this week, and that's good news for Bears pass catchers. I know that wasn't the case early on in the season, but before he got hurt, Fields had games of 335 and 282 passing yards. Tyson Bagent hasn't come close to those totals this year. The Bears get the Lions. Detroit's allowing a top 5 pass rate this year. Teams are understandably opting to throw the ball against the Lions, not just because they're good against the run, but because teams often trail against Detroit. So with Justin Fields back, we could see better passing efficiency alongside more passes in this game specifically. DJ Moore and Cole Kmet, they're going to benefit. But Darnell Mooney should too. Mooney only hit a 12.5% target share last week, but his route participation has still been really strong. It's hovered the 90% range all season. Against a Lions secondary that's allowed the 9th most adjusted points to wide receivers, he's a high variance sleeper. And then I'm going back to Jaden Reed this week too. Now, I do want to say that over the last 2 weeks, Reed has seen his route participation drop. He's run a route on roughly 47% of Green Bay's dropbacks over their last 2 games. That number was 89% the week prior to that. They're rotating him in and out more, which is really silly to me because he has by far the best yards per route run on that team this year. Anyway, we should hope that Green Bay rewards Reed for his play. Even if they don't, he can be efficient because he gets the Chargers this week and they're a top 10 opponent for wide receivers. And then the last wide receiver in this group is Curtis Samuel. He returned to action last week, and he didn't quite get back to his pre-injury route participation, but he still saw a 14% target share. If we assume a slight increase in routes run here in week 11, he could definitely come through. Washington gets the Giants. New York ranks first in the NFL in slot yards allowed this year, and Samuel's played 73% of his snaps from that area of the field this season. At tight end, I'm going back to someone that I've mentioned plenty on the show this year, and that's Luke Musgrave. The Chargers, as I've been saying, have been bad defensively this year. They rank in the bottom 10 in adjusted fantasy points allowed to every single position. Teams aren't necessarily targeting their tight ends at a higher rate against LA. Their adjusted target share allowed is pretty average, but the Chargers have allowed the 5th most adjusted points to the position. Musgrave has seen about a 15% target share over his last 5. I think he's okay enough as a streamer. And then the other streamer in this tier is Chig Okonkwo. Over Chig's last 5 games, he's hit a 19% target share per game rate. That's pretty awesome. It's a pretty ordinary matchup against Jacksonville this week, but finding tight ends in this range is just admittedly really tough. So a player seeing that kind of target share deserves a little bit of love. This next tier of players consists of guys who are rostered in 0 to 10% of Yahoo leagues. Like I say each week, we're digging deeper. Now, I don't have a quarterback streamer in this tier, so let's just move on to running back. And let's talk about Kene Nwangwu. And for the record, I believe that's the right pronunciation. I did a lot of research to say that name right. You're going to hear that name on a lot of podcasts this week probably, but I think that's the right pronunciation. Anyway, Nwangwu is rostered in fewer than 1% of leagues. I do like Ty Chandler to step in for Alexander Mattison this week and see a good number of touches. But Nwangwu's probably going to see some work himself. Chandler did outsnap him 13-3 after Madison's concussion this past week, so this is largely a projection, there's no doubt. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see Nwangwu maybe finish with 20, maybe 30% of Minnesota's backfield rushes. He's a big play guy too. He has a ton of speed. So maybe he'll do his best Keaton Mitchell impression and get it done on one play. Now moving to wide receiver, I kind of don't mind Justin Watson this week, at least as it relates to deep sleepers. And he's also rostered in fewer than 1% of Yahoo leagues. The last time we saw the Chiefs, Watson led the wide receivers in routes run. He had an 18% target share. And now the Chiefs are facing the Eagles, who have been a pass funnel. They're the top team against running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed this year. They're the worst team against wide receivers. So don't sleep on Justin Watson. The other wideout in this tier is Jalen Guyton. Guyton returned to action in Week 9, where he ran a route on 74% of LA's dropbacks. This past week, that route participation, it rose by 11 percentage points. His snap share jumped by 23%. That resulted in a 15% target share. So in a higher powered passing attack, that kind of usage can make any wide receiver relevant. And then at tight end from this group, again, it's a rough week for tight end streamers, which is probably going to be the case rest of season. But the tight end from this group is Tanner Hudson. Hudson's route participation really isn't anything special. It was just under 40% last week. But his targets per route run rate over his last two, it's been kind of awesome. He's seen 12 targets over his last two games, and the Bengals rewarded him last week with a slightly bigger role. Now, it's not a great matchup this week, but maybe Hudson's able to find another 5-target game without T. Higgins in the mix. As for the defensive streamers, things looked a lot easier and better on Monday before waivers ran. So hopefully you're able to snag a team like Washington, maybe Detroit, or maybe Miami. They're now rostered in more than 50% of Yahoo leagues. But one defense that might still work is Jacksonville. They're 7-point home favorites against the Titans, and Tennessee has had a bottom 10 pressure rate and sack rate allowed with Will Levis under center over the last 3 weeks. So I do think the Jags can work. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. And make sure you follow the Late Round Fantasy Football Instagram account at LateRoundFF, and check out the Late Round Fantasy Football YouTube channel at youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow.